So on July 29th, it was a slightly special occasion. It was Fernando Alonso's birthday. The dude had turned 40 years old and everyone was waxing lyrical about him. And why not? The dude is still killing it today. Which prompted Tomo to query whether anyone else in Formula 1 history had driven this well into their 40s. Now there are a few examples of this for sure, but one that immediately came to mind, as it did for a few others, was Fangio. But for some other people, Fangio came from an era that doesn't compare to today's. Like this dude, who claimed that Fangio's feats were pretty meh, as he achieved them against old princes and other 50-year-olds. But this, you disrespectful little shit. No, I'm not taking that. Now, yes, there were some drivers in the series who were in their 50s at the very beginning of Formula 1, with the likes of Louis Chiron and Luigi Fagioli. And the Prince of Siam did pursue Grand Prix racing, whenever he wasn't playing hide the sausage in an arm or ditch, but all these people still could drive. And good on you for cherry picking to fit your narrative, but there is a reason why the name Fangio is synonymous with greatness. Now, of course, Fangio was racing back in the days of black and white television, if you even had one, which automatically writes him off for a lot of people. The sport was relatively new back then, and the competition wasn't all that serious, given almost none of them were full-time professionals. Well, at what point did the competition in the sport become serious? Although, I will give them this. Just have a look at Fangio back then. That is the peak of human athleticism. And hey, if you want to talk about how different the era was compared to today, let's do just that. We know what the current day Formula 1 competition entails. We know how fast the cars are. We know the strength and conditioning required to sustain 5G in a corner, or 51G at cops, and how all the drivers today are paid professionals and yada yada yada. And there's no reason to kick all of that to the curb. But Fangio raced in a time where you had virtually no protective equipment, barring some headwear that may protect you from some leaves, and there was no power steering, given this was of course 1950s Grand Prix racing. Today's cars may have quite a bit more power than they had, but I mean, for f***'s sake, we're talking about the 1950s. There was nothing in the way of electronic aids. The tyres were cross-ply and loved to shred over the course of a race, which was great fun when hurling along in a car with crap loads of power but virtually no stopping ability on tracks which had plenty of nature and spectators and houses to slam into, and drivers sometimes didn't compete with seatbelts, preferring to be flung from the car into whatever was around them rather than burn alive in a tub made by Italians. Death had a bloody waiting list back then. Races today last an hour and a half. Cute. Try 3.5. And because of the physical nature of driving those burdens, they would often end the race with blistered hands and a face full of soot and dead bugs, provided you finished the race, or even survived it. I can go on all day about this stuff, but to compare the eras in the way that people have is asinine. To belittle that period of time is an insult to the sport. One of the other arguments I've seen is that Fangio is racing against old dudes and farmers and princes. Ironically, Fangio was one of the oldest drivers on that grid. He won his last world championship at the age of 46, and wasn't a great deal younger than the oldest F1 driver of all time, Louis Chiron, who raced once at the age of 55. But I mean, hey, slandering Chiron isn't something we're gonna do today either. A lot of the big names that you'd see back then, Hawthorne, Moss, Brooks, Collins, they were all in the early 20s back then. And hey look, we can look back on a few of his races, but the one that sticks out as his best, and one of the greatest drives in motor racing ever, was the 1957 German Grand Prix. Today, the Nürburgring is a pretty formidable fortress nestled within the Eifel mountain range, but back then, it had the same kind of mortality rate as a de Havilland aircraft. Heading into this round of the World Championship, Fangio was leading the standings, and could theoretically win the title, if he won the race. He took the pole by 2.8 seconds in qualifying, which sounds quite unserious, but bear in mind, this track was over 14 miles long, in a time where how big your cojones were made all the difference. And so, being on pole, driving the brilliant Maserati 250F, and on his favourite track, Fangio was looking set to walk it. He built up a 30-second lead by the time of the first pit stop, but after a bungled pit stop with the tyres, he came out of the pit lane 50 seconds behind the Ferraris of Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins. For a little bit, he pondered over what he was going to do before eventually deciding, screw it. Or so it seemed, because over the remaining 10 laps, he broke the lap record 9 times in a bid to catch the leaders. I mean, to put it in perspective, this was the lap record of the Nürburgring, set incidentally by him, in the previous year's German Grand Prix. But when he started to hunt down the Ferraris up ahead, this was the time he posted. With a lap and a half to go, Fangio had completely destroyed the lead of Hawthorne. Scythed past with 2 wheels on the freaking grass at this circuit, went on through to win the race and his 5th world title. This was one of just many great drives by Fangio, and the results speak for themselves. Yeah, he always found himself in the best car, but as Sir Sterling Moss pointed out, he was there because he was the best. Every manufacturer knew that the easiest and cheapest way to win was to sign Fangio, and this is kind of an historical precedence that is carried over onto modern times. Does that diminish what these men achieved? No. Of course it doesn't. So bearing in mind all of what we've covered, we know that he was a great driver, but was he the greatest? To that I say, there is no GOAT. As I mentioned before, these times were so different from what they are today. There's little that you can legitimately compare. You don't have to rank drivers on an all-time basis. You can just appreciate them for what they've achieved in their time. Hamilton is the greatest of his era, Schumacher was the greatest of his one, and Fangio was the best of his. Overall though, he meant a great deal to the world of motor racing and to the people of his home nation in Argentina.
Fangio is not only a name. When you say Juan Manuel Fangio, it doesn't matter who you are talking to, what their age is, or whether they have ever heard of Formula 1. That name does stick. In a country where the passion for F1 dwindles every day, the legend that is El Chueco still remains fresh as the day he won his last Grand Prix. 110 years after his birth, there are many places still named after him in Buenos Aires City. There is a statue that stands in the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart, in the streets of Monaco, and in Buenos Aires, same replicas. Every year, thousands of people go to the Fangio Museum in his hometown of Balcarce, not only to live the legacy, but the present, with donations like a signed Lewis Hamilton helmet next to the cars he used to take 5 championships with: Mercedes, Alfa Romeo, Maserati, and Lancia, and others like a McLaren MP4/2 and an Arrows. The mark he left in the Argentinian people made the day of his death, July 17th, the official motor racing day across the country. He is the only local champion to date, and as recently as 2019, there was an official model car collection launched that honored his racing legacy, complete with not only his 5 champion cars, but the Le Mans cars he competed in alongside Froilán González, Sterling Moss, Louis Rosier, the multiple Mille Emilias, and many, many more. The aura of Fangio still roams the streets to this day, and the legacy that a kid from Balcarce who liked cars left, no one could have ever imagined. Back to you, Josh.
That I could not have said better myself. Mainly cause I ain't Argentinian. I know, shocking, right? Anyways, thank you all for watching. Drop a comment below, subscribe to the channel if you're awesome, and always remember, keep it respectful, be wholesome, don't be a manus, and as always, I'll see you all later.